at NTV.
You're watching Morning at NTV. I'm Andrew Chamagid, and we're live from Kampala's Rennet Conference Center. Now, African economies are struggling, and as the lockdown effects hit closer to home, they're looking to policymakers for solutions. Arnold Segawa spoke to the Africa Department head at the International Monetary Fund, Dr. Abebe Selassie, for answers on some of the issues they're rating.
Morning at NTV. I'm Arnold Segawa. Let's shift gears just a bit and talk about fiscal space, not forgetting a monetary policy. The IMF just released very recently a regional economic outlook for sub-Saharan Africa, and we have the pleasure to have today with us Dr. Abebe Selassie, who is the Africa Director at the International Monetary Fund, joining us from Washington, D.C. Dr. Selassie, thanks for making time to speak to us. Let's start with sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this is a region that is synonymous with having little, even no fiscal space to start with, and then we're hit by a massive pandemic at the size of COVID-19. Give us a sense of how we strike a balance with burgeoning fiscal deficits, not forgetting hardly any monetary policy tools to tackle a pandemic of this size. How do we strike that balance on the monetary side vis-a-vis the fiscal side?
Thank you, Arnold. So I think that's a very good question. I think a couple of general points, perhaps, to begin with. First, I think, as you would expect, picture is quite varied across sub-Saharan Africa. So you do indeed have some countries with very, very limited fiscal space, but many of our countries do have some scope to deploy supportive policies even before the crisis. Second is, this pandemic is a completely exogenous shock. It's a mortal threat to not only people's lives, but economies. So in the midst of this crisis, what is really important is to make sure that, you protect people's lives and livelihoods. So even with constrained fiscal space, it is really, really important at the moment to be focusing all the resources countries have at addressing this immediate threat to our countries. The time to worry about fiscal space is once the crisis is behind us. That's when we need to make sure that policies are anchored on debt sustainability considerations, the usual medium-term considerations that should drive monetary and fiscal policy. So our latest report shows that growth has collapsed in the midst of this pandemic. Growth this year for the region as a whole will be of the order of 3.2% contraction. In per capita terms, that's close to 5.4% contraction in income per person for sub-Saharan Africa. So really a very, very big hit to the region. And this is a time when more supportive fiscal policy position is needed. Now, a question here then, of course, is how will you finance this more relaxed, more supportive fiscal policy position? Of course, institutions like the IMF are stepping forward to provide a lot of financing. Other international financial institutions also. There is the debt relief that the G20 has put on the table also. All of these will provide some financing possibility, but also domestic financing options are also to be put on the table at a time like this. So you raise a question about, how you strike a balance between monetary support and fiscal policy. This is a time where countries have hard-won gains of getting inflation down to low levels. So this is a time when central banks can ease monetary policy, be more supportive, provide financing options to the government by easing monetary policy. So that's how you would try and strike this balance from the domestic policy side. And then lastly, of course, if more resources still are needed, again, coming to entities like us would be an option.
Right, Doc, let's just try and think in abstract terms here. We've seen countries like South Africa cut their repo rate quite drastically, at the time where we definitely need some easy money being pushed into the many of our sub-Saharan economies. Give me a sense of with the pandemic that we are faced with, is it time for us to think about rather unorthodox monetary policy tools? And I say this in being cognizant of the fact that, something as basic as, let's say, the Taylor rule, where, in its very, very basic form, when price stability, when inflation is quite higher in relative terms, you actually do put up raise the interest rates to kind of, the repo rate to kind of arrest that. In very, 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 it's 101, really, beginners economics 101. Is it time for us to maybe be considerate of rather unorthodox monetary policy tools at a time like this, at a pandemic like this? God knows the last time we saw such meager growth was maybe in the 1930s.
So a couple of thoughts on this, perhaps. So first, I think don't forget that one reason, most important reason why some of the advanced market countries, central banks have had to do unconventional monetary easing was because they were already at the lower bound. So, interest rates were already very, very low. So in our region, most central banks, the rates are still positive. So there's still quite a lot of scope for cutting rates. And indeed, it's not just the Reserve Bank of South Africa that has done this, but across the region, we've seen central banks cutting interest rates to ease monetary conditions. And frankly, there's still more scope to do so if, of course, it depends on the outlook for inflation, monetary conditions in each country, but there is, nominal rates remain quite a bit high. So I think we would want to have exhausted that scope before you would be thinking about unconventional monetary policy. Second, is, the financial sector in most of our countries is very limited. I think South Africa is an exception, quite frankly, but in most other countries, the depth of money markets, the depth of financial markets more broadly is very constrained and very limited. Given this also, the extent to which monetary policy per se is an important tool to buttress, to support economic activity is very limited. Credit to GDP ratios, credit to the private sector as a share of GDP really is very low in most of our countries, 25-30%, and then dominated probably by some large companies, state-owned enterprises in some cases, perhaps. This contrasts with multiples of GDP in some European countries, and if you include the bond market, the equity market, really very, very large share of financing being, or economic activity coming from the financial sector. As you know, in most of our countries, we tend to use retained earnings unless the financial markets to buttress economic activity. So there is also that to consider.
Doc, this is quite fascinating. On your first answer, it's quite an interesting response, and I tried to just to sum it up. Before we actually consider unorthodox monetary policy, we need to be cognizant of the fact that many of the countries that have rather in the past considered unorthodox monetary policy, like the negative interest rates and all that, they had particularly maybe gotten to that point where they're near the effective lower bound. Now, for some of our viewers who might not know the effective lower bound very plainly, this might be at that point where a continuation in that direction vis-a-vis monetary policy might actually prove counterproductive or might not actually yield any, what can I call it, changes or any yields in that particular direction. Now, it's quite interesting when you say that many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa at that particular point had not arrived at their effective lower bound vis-a-vis, or should I say ergo, it is fair for one to actually conclude that cutting interest rates in a pandemic still would yield results. Am I right to sum it up like that?
Yes, I mean, interest rates, nominal interest rates are well above zero. So, there is scope to continue reducing them if conditions warrant it.
Right. Right. Let's bring it on to East Africa, Kenya. Definitely a region that you are very, very well acquainted with. God knows you were a resident rep in Uganda at one point. Give me a sense of how the reaction to COVID-19 has been region-wise. We could also add Ethiopia into the fray for the eastern part of the continent. Give me a sense of how our reaction, at least on the monetary side, what you have made of it as the fund.
You know, this is, of course, the most awful type of shock to have hit the region in many, many decades, right? It's a confluence of multiple shocks. I mean, you have the health shock itself, which is a threat to our people. Then you have external demand collapsing. I think it's characterized really by what's going on with travel and tourism in the region, which come to a standstill. And you know how important a sector that is for our economies. And then you have basically, the commodity prices being lower, demand for other goods and services being lower also. So it's this cocktail of adverse shocks. Financial market conditions externally also remain very weak. So it is as brutal as bad an exogenous shock as it can get. I think in response, really, countries have done very impressive policy response. I think first and foremost, I have to say, in terms of trying to keep the disease burden as low as possible, trying to protect livelihoods, countries, have moved with impressive speed. And hopefully, we will continue to see case levels being as low as they are. Here, I would note, we are far, we're not out of the woods yet by any means. We've seen how lethal this pandemic is, even in countries with much more, health capacity, implementation capacity, financial resources. So the focus has to be still that as if we are in the critical stage of the pandemic until it's well behind us. But the response so far there has been good. Monetary policy response also has been, as you would want it to be, fairly supportive of the circumstances and country tailored. So I think that we've also really liked. And fiscal policy, frankly, countries have used it to the limit to protect lives and livelihoods. So I don't think the policy response has been the issue from both East Africa and elsewhere, frankly, but the challenge really has been the severity of the shock. Subject to the policies we've seen in recent months, I think we're very hopeful that we can have, once this disease burden declines, we can have a decent recovery.
Right. One thing that was quite fascinating about your recent update on the regional economic outlook was on the fixed income securities space. Now, in the past, many have tried to come out post-2008 and just try to understand how maybe frontier and emerging markets benefited from 2008. With quantitative easing, there was some easy money that found its way, trickled into the likes of South Africa and many emerging markets. Fast forward to what we are seeing with the Great Lockdown, as it's been coined right now, of course, vis-a-vis the lockdown that we are seeing now, is the fact that because the lockdown has affected maybe each and every country, well, region-wise, and from emerging markets to developed markets, we are seeing a particular flight to safety. And this has left many of us wondering, and this is actually alluded to in your most recent update, when it comes to the spreads. What does this story tell us? The spreads right now, when it comes to the yields, at least across much of sub-Saharan Africa, vis-a-vis the Great Lockdown?
I think people were going into more liquid assets, more safe assets. But with following the massive injection in liquidity that we've seen from central banks to support economies in advanced countries, but also kind of, signs that some countries in the region are more more able to withstand, more resilient to the pandemic. We've seen somewhat of a recovery in the spread levels. They're still very high, of course, and it's not, issuing these spreads. I'm not sure how advisable that is. But at least we're seeing kind of some normalization in economic activity in financial asset prices. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out going forward. I think all of this, though, shouldn't distract us from what is needed in terms of economic policy recalibration, in our countries. First and foremost, what's really important, as I noted, is that, until the pandemic is truly, truly well behind us, I think the focus has to stay on keeping the disease burden under control and protecting lives. Once that is behind us, I think there is a really big agenda where we have to rethink our development strategies to see if it's going to be adequate to the new world that we're going to face. I think we're going to have many changes globally in terms of how economies interact with each other. I think domestically also, this is a really important moment to rethink the social contract, to think about the kind of economic policies, the kind of economic sectors we need to be focusing on to engender a strong labor-intensive growth for the coming years.
There's a striking line here when it comes to the fiscal deficits. Now, these are, of course, projected to increase to close to 7.6% of GDP by 2020. Strikingly, among the region's 35 mainly low-income countries, 9 were classified as being at high risk of debt distress, and 7 were even already in debt distress. They say when it rains, it pours. This right here is, it's just a gust, to be honest. Already some of these countries were already debt distressed, and now this comes along. They need to get some money in there. They need to push some spend via the health sector. What are the policy prescriptions for countries like this that were already kind of sitting on the edge, and now a pandemic of this magnitude just props out of nowhere? How do you even start prescribing policies for such economies? You have to have a tough job.
I think the people that have the tough job are, the policymakers, and really, they're the people that have to make the really important calls on these trade-offs on various policy options. One thing I want to take issue with is I wouldn't call what's been happening in 2020. I wouldn't characterize it as a gust. It's been really more of a hurricane than category 5 hurricane than a gust. And indeed, at a time like this, as I said earlier, I mean, the key thing you have to do is to protect lives and livelihoods. I mean, if you don't find a way to make sure that you suppress the disease, if you don't find a way to make sure that people that are being impacted so severely, the poorest, the most vulnerable, are supported, are financed through this very difficult period, you don't have an economy to worry about or debt sustainability issues that you may be facing down the road. So first and foremost, I think the attention focus has to be on this emergency response. And then once we have the pandemic, the crisis behind us a bit, then we can begin focusing about the medium to long-term issues. Issues related to debt sustainability are, of course, country-specific, but also a medium to long-term issue. Public solvency always has to be seen over how you expect economic growth, revenues, spending to evolve over a 5, 8, 10-year period. And each country is going to have to look at its policies to make sure that they're in the right direction, consistent with what country-specific needs are. So I would delineate between what's needed for this year, maybe into next year, and what's needed beyond that. And I think, one thing I can tell you is that our countries have seen even worse things. We've been very, very resilient in the past, and we already see these this resilience in some cases, and I think we will prevail. We will prevail. Thank you so much, Arnold.
Was really a pleasure, Doc. I really appreciate it. Thank you again for making time.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Arnold Sego. That was quite an insightful conversation with the International Monetary Fund. And you and I could have picked a couple of issues here and there, possibly how we can make the solutions post-COVID-19. That will take us for a break, and we'll be back with more.